When we picture the Vikings, it is often the clash of swords, the billow of sails, and the roar of northern seas that fills our imagination. We imagine their longships slicing across cold waters, their warriors fierce and determined, their sagas filled with both glory and loss. Yet beneath this romantic and often brutal image lies a quieter truth, one less glamorous but perhaps more vital. For all their strength and daring, the Vikings were still human beings, bound by the same needs as you and I. They could not fight, or sail, explore, or conquer if their most basic requirement was not met: the need for fresh water. Consider for a moment the simplicity of thirst. You and I can quench it in an instant, a glass filled from a tap, cool and clean, taken for granted. But for the Viking, setting out on a voyage that might last days or even weeks, thirst was a shadow that never disappeared. It lingered at the edge of every decision, every mile traveled, every storm endured. The sea which gave them life also threatened to take it away. Its waters, endless and glittering, could not be drunk. Salt would parch rather than refresh. To drink it was to invite delirium, weakness, even death. And so the great question emerged: how did they store and safeguard the water they needed? The easy answer might seem obvious: barrels. After all, when we imagine wooden ships, we often picture barrels stacked in the hold, filled with food, wine, or water. But here lies the twist: in the early centuries of Viking life, the barrel was not yet the universal tool of storage. That familiar image of staves, bound by iron hoops, belongs more to the later medieval world, when trade routes and carpentry techniques had spread more widely. The Vikings in their prime had to find other ways, and it is in this search for alternatives that their ingenuity shines most brightly. To understand the full weight of this challenge, let us step into their world. Imagine the deck of a longship at dawn. The horizon is pale with the first light of day. The crew stirs from restless sleep, huddled in their cloaks, salt spray still clinging to their faces. Around them stretches the sea, vast and endless, the waves rising and falling like the breath of some great sleeping giant. The men will need water today, as they did yesterday, as they will tomorrow. Yet there is no easy solution waiting in neat containers below deck. Every drop they drink has been thought about, planned for, preserved with care. Every sip is part of a fragile balance between survival and danger. For the Vikings, water was not just a resource, it was a constant question of endurance. Too little, and the body weakens. Too much salt, and it poisons. Stale supplies bring sickness. In this fragile space between abundance and scarcity, they had to navigate not only the waves of the ocean, but also the waves of human need. Their solutions were many, some clever, some simple, some born of necessity, and others of tradition. But before we uncover them, we must first pause to feel the suspense of the problem itself. This is the story rarely told in sagas. The poets sang of heroes and gods, of battles and kingdoms. They did not sing of the aching dryness of the throat, of the cracked lips, of the longing for a clean mouthful of water. And yet, without solving that very problem, there would be no voyages to sing of at all. The epic sweep of Viking history, raids across Britain, settlements in Iceland, trade with Byzantium, even the daring leap to North America, all of it depended on something as humble and invisible as stored water. It is here that history becomes intimate. When we speak of kings and warriors, the scale feels grand, perhaps even distant, but thirst is universal. You and I can imagine it with ease. We have felt it on a hot day, after a long walk, or waking in the night with a dry throat. Now magnify that feeling. Imagine it under the hot sun on the open sea, with no shade and no relief. Imagine it in the cold winds of the north, where salt spray freezes on your face, but still does not soothe your throat. Imagine it when the ship has been blown off course, supplies running low, rain clouds refusing to gather. Suddenly the problem of the Vikings is no longer theirs alone, it becomes ours as well. And so this tale begins not with the clang of steel or the clash of empires, but with a quieter sound, the slosh of water carried in fragile containers, the careful sharing of a drink among comrades, the whispered prayers that the next river or rainstorm will provide more. The Vikings were warriors, yes, but they were also guardians of a most precious resource. Their survival was not only a matter of courage, but of planning, craftsmanship, and a deep relationship with the natural world. As we move through this journey together, we will explore the many methods by which they faced this challenge. We will see how they borrowed ideas from other cultures, and how they adapted their own traditions. We will walk the decks of their ships, peer into the skins, jars and troughs that held their water, and stand in awe at their ingenuity. But first we must remember this: every story of exploration is also a story of survival, and survival, in its simplest form, begins with a drink of water. The question hangs in the air, much like the mist above a northern fjord: how did the Vikings store water without barrels? By the time we reach the end of this tale, the mystery will be unraveled. But for now, let us linger in that moment of uncertainty, in the space where curiosity awakens and wonder grows. For in that space lies the heart of discovery, and the quiet beginning of our journey into the lives of those who sailed before us. Long before the Vikings carved their longships and set sail across the North Atlantic, humankind faced the same eternal dilemma: how to carry water when the journey was longer than a single day. To us, water may seem weightless and ordinary, a resource so common that it fades into the background of our lives. Yet, water, paradoxically, is heavy, fragile, and always at risk of corruption. To carry it across land is a burden. To preserve it across seas is a science. And to do all of this before the invention of the wooden barrel required ingenuity stretching back thousands of years. The story of human travel is in many ways the story of thirst. When the caravans of Mesopotamia crossed dusty plains, they loaded clay jars onto the backs of donkeys and camels. These jars, called amphorae by the Greeks, and similar names in other cultures, were fragile yet effective. Their long, slender necks slowed evaporation, and their sealed tops kept dust away. Still, they could break with a single fall, spilling precious liquid into the sand. Each step of a caravan was a balance between progress and preservation. In Egypt, the Nile was both blessing and teacher. Clay vessels lined the riverbanks, filled with water drawn from its depths. These containers could be carried short distances, but to travel beyond the fertile banks required something sturdier. The Egyptians experimented with leather skins sewn tight with sinew, a method that would echo later in the north. But the problem never disappeared. Water grew stale. It absorbed the flavor of its container, becoming earthy, bitter, or sour. Even in the shadow of pyramids, thirst was a quiet but relentless adversary. The Romans, masters of engineering, pushed the art of water storage further. Their amphorae traveled the Mediterranean, filled with wine, oil, and yes, water. Great ships carried them stacked neatly in rows, their pointed bases resting in sand or racks designed to hold them steady. The Romans built aqueducts and fountains, but at sea even they returned to the humble jar. Amphorae could cross seas, but they were cumbersome. To store large quantities required both space and careful handling. A sailor on a Roman vessel knew that water was as precious as gold, for storms might smash the cargo and spill life itself into the waves. And then there were the nomads, the Bedouin of the desert, and the tribes of the steppe. To them the water skin was both lifeline and tradition. Animal hides, carefully treated, could hold surprising volumes. They were light, flexible, and easier to carry than brittle clay. Yet, skins had their own flaws. They leaked if not sewn well, they spoiled if not cared for, and they imparted a taste of leather, of oil, of the animal itself into every drink. Survival was not always pleasant. The mouthfuls swallowed on those journeys were less about comfort than endurance. By the time the Norse world was rising in the north, these methods had been carried and traded across continents. Merchants brought amphorae up rivers. Skins traveled with traders. Wooden troughs and carved containers existed in farms and villages. Yet, none of these offered the perfect solution for a long voyage upon a northern sea. The Viking challenge was not a new one, but it was sharper, harsher, more urgent. Unlike land caravans, a ship could not simply stop at the next oasis. Unlike Roman galleys, A longship did not have the cavernous space to store rows upon rows of amphorae. And unlike desert nomads, the Vikings faced not heat alone, but salt spray, freezing winds, and the corrosion of brine. Imagine then the scale of their challenge. Each man aboard a ship needed perhaps 2 or 3 liters of fresh water every day, more if the weather was warm or the work exhausting. A crew of 40 sailing for a week would need nearly 1,000 liters. That is not a luxury, that is survival. Where could it all be stored? In what vessels could it endure the shaking of storms, the battering of waves, the endless rocking of the hull? The problem was ancient, but on the deck of a Viking ship, it became immediate, visceral, unavoidable. Here lies the irony. The seas that the Vikings mastered were filled with water, but none of it could sustain them. To drink salt water is to court death. At first it seems to quench, wetting the mouth, tricking the tongue, but soon it overwhelms the body. Salt draws moisture from the very cells, and thirst deepens rather than lessens. Muscles weaken, vision clouds, madness creeps in. Ancient sailors everywhere learned this the hard way, and stories of cursed thirst echo across cultures. In Greek myth, Tantalus is condemned to stand in water he cannot drink. In Norse legend, giants and gods alike fear the vast and deadly sea. Always, the danger of thirst runs like an undercurrent beneath the surface of these tales. It is important to understand that barrels, as we know them, were not always a given. Today the word seems timeless, as though wooden casks bound by iron hoops have always existed. But they are in truth a later invention, born of refined carpentry and metallurgy. Before their spread, civilizations improvised. They used what was at hand: clay, hide, wood, stone. The Vikings inherited this ancient problem, and in their cold world of fjords and forests, they sought answers not in a single perfect vessel, but in a patchwork of many. Thus the stage is set. The Norsemen, brilliant sailors and fearless raiders, were not the first to struggle with the riddle of water at sea. They stood upon the shoulders of countless generations who had carried jars through deserts, skins across plains, amphorae across oceans. But they would need to adapt those lessons, to bend them to the unique demands of northern waters. Their ships were smaller, faster, designed for rivers as well as seas. Their voyages could last not just days, but weeks, stretching into the unknown. They could not afford fragility, and they could not endure waste. When we think of the Viking world, it is easy to imagine axes and swords, shields and sagas, but perhaps the truer image is quieter. Picture a man carefully sealing a leather bag with resin, his hands practiced and sure. Picture another lowering a clay jar gently into straw, tucking it safe against the wooden hull. Picture a sailor tipping a container to share a small cup among his comrades. The water warm, perhaps flavored faintly by wood or skin, yet no less precious for it. This was survival, carried in humble vessels shaped by necessity. The problem of water at sea was not solved by the Vikings alone, nor was it solved quickly. It is a thread woven through human history, a reminder that even the mightiest warriors depend upon the simplest needs. Before barrels became the common answer, there was this long, uncertain struggle, and it is into that struggle that the Vikings stepped, bringing with them both the traditions of the past and the innovations of their own world. Their solutions would be many, some borrowed, some invented, some imperfect yet enduring. But before we turn to them, let us hold in mind the enormity of their task. Across the sands of deserts, the stones of Rome, the banks of the Nile, and the decks of Viking ships, the question of water has always been the same. It is not a small question, it is the foundation of every journey, the silent companion of every voyage. And in the centuries before barrels, it was the riddle that every traveler had to answer. To understand the water problem of the Vikings, we must first step fully into their world, onto the deck of the longship itself. It is one thing to speak of storage jars, amphorae, or skins in the abstract. It is another to imagine the daily rhythm of life, where these containers were not curiosities, but lifelines. So let us draw closer, let us board the ship, and see the Viking voyage as it truly was. The Viking longship was unlike any other vessel of its time. Long, narrow and shallow keel, it could glide across oceans, but also slip up narrow rivers and beach itself on a strip of sand. Its prow curved high, often carved with a dragon's head, a serpent, or some other fierce creature, meant to inspire awe. Its hull was built of overlapping planks, clinker-built, strong yet flexible, capable of bending with the waves, rather than resisting them. For speed and maneuverability, it was unmatched. But what it possessed in agility, it lacked in comfort. There was no deep hold for barrels and crates, no sheltered deck where sailors could rest. The men lived entirely in the open, exposed to sky and sea alike. They sat on their sea chests, which served both as storage for personal belongings and as benches for rowing. When night fell, they lay down on the deck, wrapped in cloaks of wool or fur, sometimes covering themselves with their sail, if the weather allowed. The ship itself was no larger than a city bus, and into that narrow space, 40 or more men might be crowded together. Now imagine such a space, days into a voyage. The sea is restless, the spray is constant, and the air smells of brine and damp wood. Supplies are packed tightly, sacks of dried fish, smoked meat, flatbreads, weapons, tools, and yes, the precious containers of water. But where to put them? There is no cellar below, no storage room within. Everything rests with the crew, shifting with the roll of the ship. A jar might be tucked near the mast, cushioned with rope and cloth, to keep it from cracking. A leather bag might be tied to a post. Every drop is guarded, every container treated with care, for to lose one is to lose life itself. The daily routine was hard, relentless. If the winds were kind, the sail filled, and the oars could rest. If not, the men rowed for hours, their backs bending to the steady rhythm of the stroke. Salt spray soaked their clothes, numbed their hands, and stung their eyes. Hunger gnawed at them, but thirst was worse. The sea stretched endlessly around them, but they could only drink from the small stores they had carried. When a container was opened, it was shared carefully. Perhaps a dipper or horn cup was filled, and passed from hand to hand. Each man took only what was needed, no more, for all knew how quickly the supply might vanish. Life aboard the longship was noisy by day, and strangely quiet by night. During daylight hours, the slap of oars, the creak of wood, the snap of the sail, and the cries of gulls filled the air. But at night, only the sound of waves remained. The men lay huddled together, listening to the water lapping against the hull. Thirst sometimes woke them, dry throats reminding them of the limits of their world. A sip might be taken reluctantly, sparingly. Too much, and tomorrow would bring regret. Too little, and the body weakened. Always, balance was required. The ship itself carried little protection against weather. Rain might drench the men and their supplies alike. Cold could stiffen their limbs and dampen their spirits. Sun could beat down mercilessly, especially on long summer voyages, drying throats and cracking lips. Each element pressed the water supply harder, demanding careful judgment. Should they drink freely now, hoping for rain later, or should they ration, tightening the belt of thirst in exchange for a longer endurance? These were not abstract questions, but ones of immediate survival. The hardships extended beyond thirst. Food, though carried in greater supply, was often monotonous. Dried fish, salted meat, flat cakes of bread, ale or mead might sometimes accompany a meal, but not always. Sickness could spread quickly in the close quarters of the ship. Seasickness afflicted many, draining them of strength and robbing them of appetite. In those moments, water was even more vital. To drink too little was to fade. To drink too much at once could be wasteful. Even the strongest warrior was made humble by his need for a simple swallow of fresh water. And yet, amidst these difficulties, the Vikings endured. Their lives were bound to the sea, their bodies adapted to its challenges, their minds sharpened by necessity. They did not expect ease, for their culture valued hardship as a test of strength. To endure thirst without complaint was a mark of discipline. To share water fairly without greed was a mark of honor. In the sagas, men are remembered for their courage in battle, but on the ship, they were remembered for their endurance in the face of discomfort. The longship was not only a vessel of war, but also of exploration. Families sometimes traveled aboard, settlers heading toward Iceland, Greenland, or beyond. In those moments, the water problem became even more complex. Children could not endure thirst, as well as grown men. Women required care, in harsh conditions. Supplies had to be stretched further, and every mouthful measured with greater caution. To imagine such voyages is to imagine not just warriors, but households afloat upon a fragile wooden craft, carrying their lives into the unknown, with only their courage and their water stores to sustain them. It is easy to see why water became the center of so many decisions: when to set out, when to turn back, when to stop on shore to refill, when to pray for rain. All of these choices revolved around liquid more precious than treasure. Gold could not quench thirst, silver could not restore strength. Only water, carried in its humble containers, made survival possible. Thus the life aboard the Viking longship was not one of constant glory, but of constant calculation. Every day was measured against supplies, every wave reminded the crew of their fragility. Every swallow of water bound them closer together, reminding them of their shared fate. This was the world in which their ingenuity was tested, the stage upon which their survival skills played out. So when we ask the question, how did the Vikings store water without barrels, we must remember that it was not simply a technical puzzle. It was the heartbeat of their voyages, woven into the fabric of their daily lives. To understand their methods, we must first feel their need, and that need aboard the longship was as vast and unending as the sea itself. When we think of wood in the Viking world, we imagine the proud curve of the longship, the towering halls, with their beams blackened by smoke, and the shields painted with bright designs. But wood was not only the stuff of ships and houses, it was also the material from which daily survival was crafted, carved, shaped, and fashioned into vessels of every kind. Before the familiar barrel became the common companion of seafarers, the Vikings turned to other wooden containers, simpler in form, but ingenious in function. To understand their world, we must linger among these vessels, feel the grain beneath the hand, and see how necessity shaped wood into life-saving forms. Wood was abundant in Scandinavia. The deep forests of oak, ash, pine, and birch provided the raw materials for nearly every aspect of Viking life. From the keel of a ship to the handle of an axe, wood was constant, familiar, and trusted. It was no surprise, then, that it also became the basis of their earliest attempts to store water. Carpenters, skilled with axe and adze, could hollow out a trunk into a trough or shape planks into a box. These containers were heavy, yes, and far from perfect, but in a world without barrels, they were solutions born of practicality. The trough was perhaps the simplest of all. Imagine a log, thick and sturdy, split and hollowed until it formed a long basin. Such troughs were common on farms, used to hold water for animals or to collect rain. In a ship, a smaller version might be carried, wedged between supplies, filled with water when needed. It was not elegant, and it did not preserve water for long, but it was serviceable. The open surface allowed evaporation. The rocking of the sea might spill precious drops, yet still it gave the crew access to what they needed most. More refined were the lidded boxes. These were made from planks, fitted tightly together, sealed with pitch or resin, and bound with rope or rawhide. Unlike a trough, they could be closed, keeping out dirt, salt spray, and insects. But the weakness lay in the joinery. Without the precision of iron hoops to hold the staves, seams could warp or separate. When the wood swelled with moisture, maintenance was constant. Resin had to be reapplied, cracks had to be patched, and sometimes entire boxes had to be discarded. Yet even with these flaws, such wooden containers played their role in bridging the gap between the ancient amphora and the future barrel. Some vessels were not boxes at all, but carved from single blocks of wood. A hollowed log could become a small cask or tub, sturdier than a plank-built box because it lacked seams. These solid vessels were heavy, almost immovable once filled, but they had the virtue of durability. Archaeological finds from Scandinavian sites suggest that such tubs and buckets were common, used not only on ships, but in households, where they held water, milk, or ale. One can imagine sailors lifting such a tub aboard, bracing it against the mast, and dipping ladles into it, when thirst pressed too strongly. What these wooden containers lacked in efficiency, they made up for in familiarity. Every farmstead had them. Every household relied upon them. They were the everyday tools of life, easily adapted to the extraordinary demands of a sea voyage. A Viking crew did not require invention from nothing. They required adaptation, and so they brought aboard the vessels they knew, reshaping their daily tools into maritime lifelines. The craftsmanship behind these containers was no less impressive than that of a longship. Viking woodworkers had inherited traditions of carving that stretched back centuries. With axes sharpened to a keen edge, they could split logs with precision. With adzes, they hollowed out bowls and troughs. With knives, they carved fine details into wooden spoons, ladles and cups. It is easy to forget that the same hands which fashioned dragon prows and intricate runestones also shaped the humbler vessels that preserved water. In the Viking world, artistry and utility walked hand in hand, yet these wooden vessels faced a relentless enemy. Time. Water stored in an open tub quickly grew stale. In a closed box, it might taste of resin or wood. Warmth hastened spoilage. The sloshing of the ship meant spills were inevitable. Unlike the later barrel, which could be rolled, stacked, and sealed with remarkable efficiency, these earlier vessels demanded constant vigilance. Men had to guard them, refill them, and drink sparingly. In this way, the water problem was not only technological but social. Discipline mattered as much as design. Consider the rhythm of such care. Each morning, a sailor might check the seams of a wooden box, pressing resin into any gaps, tightening cords where they had loosened. Another might ladle water into smaller cups or skins, distributing them among the crew. Still another might pour from a larger tub into a leather bag, easier to carry on deck. The ship itself became a dance of containers, each playing its part, each fragile in its own way. The absence of barrels was not the absence of order, it was the presence of many small solutions woven together. We must not imagine these methods as primitive, but as steps along a path. The barrel, when it came, was not an invention sprung from nothing. It was the child of these troughs, boxes, and tubs. It refined their strengths and corrected their weaknesses. But until that moment, the Vikings endured with what they had, and what they had was enough. Their voyages were not prevented, their raids not halted, their explorations not diminished. They carved, they patched, they preserved, they survived. The reliance on wooden vessels also speaks to the intimacy of Viking life with the forest. Unlike cultures of stone or desert, the Norse lived in landscapes where trees were constant companions. Their myths are filled with trees. Yggdrasil, the world tree, stands at the center of their cosmos. Their ancestors were said to be shaped from ash and elm. To turn wood into vessels of survival was not merely practical, but deeply symbolic. Each sip of water taken from a hollowed log or a sealed box was a sip drawn from the bounty of the forest, a reminder of the bond between man, tree, and sea. And so, when we imagine the Viking ship without barrels, let us not see a crew adrift without hope. Let us see instead the careful placement of wooden tubs, the sealing of boxes with pitch, the daily checking of seams, and the constant vigilance of sailors who knew that their survival lay not only in the strength of their arms, but in the care of their containers. It was a world where nothing could be wasted, where every drop was precious, and where even the simplest vessel might mean the difference between life and death. This then was the stage before barrels, a time of troughs and boxes, of tubs and hollowed logs, of daily maintenance and constant care. A time when ingenuity did not yet wear the polished form of a casque, but still carried men across oceans. A time when wood, in its many shapes, was trusted to hold not only the weight of ships, but also the weight of life itself. Water in the Viking Age was not only drawn from ships and storage skins, it began with the natural world itself. Before horns, skins and wooden vessels were even considered, the Vikings first turned to the sources of fresh water that the northern landscapes provided. The well, the stream, and the spring were more than mere features of geography. They were lifelines, sacred places, and gathering points of daily life. Imagine standing in a Viking village at dawn. The houses, their thatched roofs glistening with dew, are clustered close together. Beyond them lies the communal well, a deep shaft dug carefully into the earth. Around its rim, women draw water with wooden buckets, the cords creaking as they haul up the morning's supply. This daily ritual was more than practical, it was also social, where neighbors exchanged words, where children played at the edge, and where news traveled almost as swiftly as the water itself. The well was both gift and risk. To dig one demanded knowledge. The Vikings needed to find groundwater and carve down deep enough to reach it. Some wells were simple holes, shored with wood, while others were lined with stone to prevent collapse. The deeper the well, the purer the water tended to be, shielded from surface runoff or animal waste. Yet even a good well could sour if care was not taken. That is why wells were respected places, often treated with ritual care. For without them, the village could not thrive. Springs held a special status. Unlike wells, which required human effort to reach water, a spring offered its gift freely, bubbling clear and cold from the earth. In the sagas and in Norse mythology, springs are often connected to the divine. The most famous spring is perhaps Urd's well, which nourished Yggdrasil, the great world tree of Norse cosmology. Such associations made springs not only practical, but also mystical. To drink from one was to drink from something touched by the sacred, a reminder that water was as much a spiritual blessing as a physical necessity. Streams and rivers completed the picture. Scandinavia is a land of water, carved by glaciers into valleys rich with flowing currents. Viking settlements often grew near rivers, where fresh water was close at hand and fishing could provide food alongside it. Yet rivers and streams also carried dangers. Floods could wash away banks, and pollutants from upstream could spoil what seemed clear. Still, for the Vikings, rivers were arteries of both water and travel. They were highways that connected villages, farmlands, and eventually the world beyond. When storing water without barrels, the Vikings relied on these natural sources as their foundation. No skin or horn could hold water if there was none to draw. Therefore, understanding and protecting wells, springs and streams was essential. Water gathering was woven into daily rhythms. Every morning and evening, families refilled their vessels. On journeys when rivers were nearby, ships could anchor briefly, and crewmen would wade ashore to refill skins directly from the stream. The natural cycle was thus mirrored by the human one. As water flowed, so too did Viking life. In sagas there are glimpses of this relationship. Heroes drink from mountain streams, their thirst quenched in moments of hardship. Springs appear at turning points in stories, as though guiding destiny itself. Even today, archaeologists uncover wells at Viking-age farmsteads, their stone linings still intact, whispering of the countless hands that once lowered buckets into their depths. To stand beside one is to feel time itself condensed into silence, the same silence the Vikings knew when they first leaned over and saw their reflection shimmering back. Water from these natural sources was often consumed fresh, though it could also be boiled or mixed with ale to ensure safety. Springs in particular, emerging cold and mineral-rich, were prized for their purity. Yet for longer journeys, natural sources were not always near, which is why storage methods became vital. Still, in the mind of a Viking, the clearest water always flowed directly from the land. No vessel, however carefully prepared, could match the taste of a cold spring after hours of toil in the fields or days of rowing at sea. What is striking is how intertwined water was with community memory. Wells were sometimes dedicated to gods, or given small offerings to ensure continued flow. A coin, a carved wooden figure, even food could be dropped in as a gesture of gratitude. Such practices echo the deep respect the Norse held for water's power. They knew its dual nature. It could sustain, or it could destroy. Springs might dry, rivers might flood, wells might collapse. This uncertainty only heightened the reverence felt for every drop. In Viking poetry, water is sometimes called the bright one, or the flowing gift. Such language reflects an intimacy with the element that modern people with taps and plumbing often overlook. For the Vikings, water had to be sought, carried, and protected. Each encounter with it was deliberate, not casual. This effort built a closeness, a recognition that life was always one bucketful away from thirst. To picture it clearly, a child in a Viking farmstead runs barefoot to the well with a small cup, dipping it into the cool depth and bringing it back to the hearth. A woman bends over a stream, washing wool in the rushing current, humming to herself as the fabric softens. A warrior, pausing at a spring on his way to a raid, drinks deeply and feels his strength return. These are simple images, yet together they form the backbone of Viking survival. And so, when we ask how Vikings stored water without barrels, we must first remember that the natural world stored it for them. Wells, streams, and springs provided the constant foundation. From these they filled their horns, skins, and vessels. Without the land's hidden veins, no craft of man could preserve water for long. This connection between natural source and human ingenuity is what kept Viking villages alive, through summer droughts and winter freezes, through voyages across fjords and expeditions into unknown seas. Every sip they took carried a reminder: water was not theirs to own, only theirs to borrow. The wells might one day run dry, the springs might shift, the rivers might freeze, but while they flowed, they nourished both body and spirit. The Vikings knew this truth well, and they wove it into their myths, their daily tasks, and their survival strategies. Thus, wells, streams, and springs were not just places of water, they were places of life. And every vessel, every skin, every careful method of storage began with their flowing gift. When we imagine the Vikings setting sail, it is easy to picture mighty oak ships, strong warriors with axes, and perhaps a hoard of shining treasures. But far more humble objects made these journeys possible: the simple vessels in which water and other liquids were stored. In a world before metal tanks, before glass bottles became common, and before the widespread use of large wooden barrels, the Vikings relied on a variety of natural materials that could be shaped, sewn, and hardened into containers. Clay, leather, and wood were not merely the materials of everyday life, they were the lifelines of exploration. Clay was one of the oldest container materials known to humanity, and the Vikings inherited this tradition. Across Scandinavia, simple pottery was produced, though not in the industrial quantities seen in Mediterranean societies. Clay jars, carefully fired in earth ovens, were heavy and breakable, but they were excellent at keeping liquids cool. Archaeological digs have uncovered fragments of Norse pottery with burnished surfaces, sometimes decorated with simple incised lines. These were not works of luxury, they were utilitarian. A clay pot could hold water safely at home or in a farmhouse, keeping it fresh in a way that wood or skin sometimes struggled to do. Yet, on the open sea, the fragility of clay was a problem. One hard wave, one sudden fall, and a jar might shatter. Still, in villages and settlements, clay was part of the everyday water story. Leather, by contrast, offered flexibility and resilience. The Vikings, like many ancient peoples, were masters at working with animal hides. When cleaned, treated, and stitched, leather could be turned into watertight bags or flasks. Think of a water skin shaped from the hide of a goat or cow, sealed with resin at the seams. Such containers were light and portable, perfect for a raiding party or for a farmer working in distant fields. They could be slung across the back or tied to a pack, their soft walls collapsing as the water was drained, making them easy to carry once empty. Leather had its drawbacks. Of course, it could take on the taste of whatever it held, and over time it could stiffen or crack. But when properly cared for, it was an invaluable material. The Viking reliance on animal husbandry ensured that hides were plentiful, and water skins became part of the invisible technology that sustained both land and sea journeys. Then there was wood, arguably the Vikings' most versatile resource. Scandinavia was thick with forests, and Viking craftsmen were expert in shaping timber. While the iconic wooden barrel had not yet become the dominant container of the North, wood was still widely used. Hollowed logs could be carved into troughs or small buckets. Staves, planks carefully shaped and bound with rope or metal, formed tubs and pails that could hold water or ale. Wooden containers had a sturdiness that leather lacked and a resilience that clay could not match. They could be made large enough to store communal supplies or small enough for personal use. Though these early wooden vessels lacked the efficiency of the barrel, they carried the seeds of that later invention. In many Viking homesteads, wooden buckets would stand near wells or hearths, part of the daily rhythm of carrying, pouring, and storing. Each of these materials, clay, leather, and wood, was suited to particular needs: clay for stationary storage, leather for mobility, wood for durability. Together they formed a toolkit that allowed the Vikings to adapt to different environments. Imagine a Viking farmer preparing for the summer, a clay pot at home keeping the family's water cool, a leather skin tied at the waist for work in the fields, a wooden bucket lowered into a well to draw the day's supply. Or picture a raider boarding a longship, a leather water skin at his side, a wooden vessel stowed below deck for communal use, perhaps even a small clay jar, carefully padded among other goods. The choice of container reflected not only practical necessity, but the rhythm of life itself. Archaeology offers us glimpses into this material culture. Excavations of Viking sites in Denmark, Norway, and Sweden have uncovered clay fragments, leather scraps, and the remains of wooden tubs. Often these items were not grand or decorated, they were plain, functional, built to serve rather than impress. Yet, in their simplicity lies a kind of genius. To take the skin of an animal, the earth beneath one's feet, or the wood of the surrounding forest, and to shape it into a vessel capable of carrying life-sustaining water, this was an art of survival. Each container told a quiet story of human ingenuity and the eternal need for nourishment. Beyond mere function, these vessels had symbolic weight as well. Water itself was sacred in Norse culture, linked to wells of wisdom and mythic springs. A container was more than an object, it was a keeper of something precious, something tied to both body and spirit. A leather water skin carefully stitched by hand might carry not just liquid, but the assurance of life across uncertain journeys. A wooden bucket, hewn by a father, might be passed to a son, its practical value bound up with memory and continuity. Even the humble clay pot, cracked and repaired, bore witness to meals shared, droughts endured, and seasons passed. One can imagine the sensory world of these vessels, the earthy coolness of clay on a hot day, the slightly musky scent of leather, the rough grain of wood beneath calloused fingers. Each offered a tactile reminder of the natural world transformed by human hands. For the Vikings, who lived so closely bound to the land and sea, such reminders were constant. Their world was built of wood, leather, and clay. Their survival depended on turning these raw materials into tools of endurance. It is tempting in our age of plastic bottles and metal flasks to overlook the brilliance of such simple designs. Yet, when we look closely, we see how each solution reflected deep ecological knowledge. The Vikings understood the properties of their materials intimately, how to harden clay in fire, how to tan leather until it was supple and strong, how to split and bend wood so it would hold water without leaking. These were not trivial skills, they were the foundation of resilience in a harsh environment. To travel across seas without reliable water storage would have been impossible. To farm and fish without containers to carry and store would have been unthinkable. The vessels of clay, leather and wood were therefore not marginal, but central to Viking life. And so, the story of Viking water storage is not just about barrels or the lack of them. It is about a continuum of human creativity, about adapting old materials to new challenges, and about finding ways to carry life through the uncertain paths of land and sea. Clay, leather, and wood may seem humble, but in their quiet strength, they carried the weight of survival, exploration, and memory. They were the vessels of a people forever on the move, yet forever tied to the rhythms of earth, beast, and tree. In the Viking world, no matter how advanced their shipbuilding or how fearsome their warriors, life still depended on something humble and simple: clean water. And for many Norse communities, the solution came not in barrels, clay pots, or even skins, but in the natural flow of the land itself, streams, springs, and rivulets that bubbled through the rugged countryside. These were nature's own barrels, storing water in a system far more ancient than human craftsmanship. Imagine walking through a Viking settlement, nestled in a fjord. Wooden houses stand with their turf roofs blending into the green hills. Just beyond the last dwelling, a narrow stream trickles down the slope, its waters fed by melting snow high in the mountains. Here women bend with wooden ladles and scoop fresh, cold liquid into small containers, often buckets made of wood staves or woven baskets lined with resin. Children splash beside them, their laughter echoing over the sound of rushing water. This scene might seem ordinary, yet it is a reminder that fresh streams and springs were lifelines for entire communities. What made these waters so valuable was not only their abundance, but also their purity. Mountain springs in Scandinavia were naturally filtered through layers of stone and soil. In places where wells could not easily be dug, Perhaps because of hard rock beneath the soil, or the dangers of flooding, these natural sources were indispensable. A spring bubbling from the earth was more than just convenient, it was sacred, a gift from the land itself. Some were even associated with local spirits or gods. To the Norse, water was not only practical, but deeply spiritual, tied to fertility, health, and blessing. The Vikings often devised clever ways to make use of flowing water. Archaeological evidence from Scandinavia and Norse settlements abroad suggests that troughs, carved wooden channels, and stone-lined paths sometimes directed water from streams into villages. This made it easier for households to collect it without needing to trek to the source every time. In some places, families built small shelters or covers above springs, protecting the source from dirt, animals, or falling leaves. These protective measures reveal how much they valued keeping water clean. On journeys inland, streams and rivers also guided Viking travelers. Long before maps were commonplace, waterways were natural highways, showing the way to settlements, farms, and gathering places. While boats carried them across larger rivers, smaller streams became places to stop, refresh, and refill. Water scooped straight from a moving current, still cold and lively, could refresh weary bodies during long expeditions across forests and valleys. Unlike stagnant ponds or swamps, running water was far safer to drink, less likely to harbor dangerous microbes. Even if the Vikings did not understand germs, they understood from experience which waters brought sickness and which brought strength. But relying on streams and springs was not without challenges. A dry season could reduce the flow to a trickle. In winter, when ice sealed the surface, villagers had to break through with axes or carry snow back to melt. During raids or journeys overseas, a spring might not always be nearby, and for seafaring people, the question was always the same: how to carry this fresh gift of the land onto the salty, endless sea. Still at home, the stream was a silent companion, its presence reassuring, its rhythm steady. It was constant, dependable, and shared by all. Springs also carried cultural meaning. Some were considered healing waters. Norse sagas occasionally reference wells and springs where the sick were taken for recovery, or where oaths were sworn beside the water's edge. It is not difficult to imagine a mother filling her bucket, pausing to whisper a prayer for health or safety into the rippling surface. These quiet gestures reveal a people who did not separate survival from reverence. To drink from a spring was to touch both necessity and mystery. For Viking farms, streams often meant fertile land. Water that flowed past their boundaries nourished the soil, fed livestock, and kept meadows green. Cattle, sheep, and horses were led to drink, their heavy steps muddying the edges, while birds wheeled overhead. The same waters that filled buckets for drinking also sustained the broader web of life on which the community depended. In this way, streams were not simply resources, but arteries, pulsing with the energy that tied animals, crops, and people together. If we step back and imagine the Viking world without barrels, without the image of neat rows of wooden casks stored in the hull of a ship, it is herein, the rushing spring, the bubbling brook, that we see the answer. This was water stored not in human containers, but in the embrace of the land itself. It required no carpenter's hand, no iron hoops, no seal of tar. It was older than memory, more dependable than craft. When a Viking bent down and cupped water in his palm, he was drinking from the same flow that had nourished generations before him, and that would continue long after his bones returned to the earth. In the quiet of the night, after the last chores were finished, the sound of the stream might carry through the settlement. Its music was a lullaby, constant and patient. Perhaps children drifted to sleep, hearing it outside their homes, comforted by the knowledge that the water would still be there when morning came. Streams and springs were humble, yet they were life, and in them the Vikings found a source of survival, so reliable, it could be trusted more than any barrel. When we imagine Vikings, our minds often drift to the open sea, to long ships slicing through frothing waves, sails catching the northern wind, warriors gripping oars. But the story of Viking water is not only one of the ocean, it is also a story of the land, of places where water welled up quietly from the earth, where springs bubbled in forest glades, and where entire communities came together to draw life from the soil itself. To understand how Vikings secured their water, we must turn from the salt of the sea to the sweetness of the ground. Across Scandinavia, villages often relied on wells. These were not the elaborate stone wells of later medieval Europe, with ornate wooden roofs and careful masonry. Viking wells were humbler, dug into the soil, and lined with timber or stone to prevent collapse. Some were little more than shallow shafts, reaching down to the groundwater table, while others were deep, carefully reinforced pits that showed the hand of skilled craftsmanship. Archaeologists have uncovered such wells in Viking farmsteads, their linings still intact, whispering of the people who once lowered buckets down into the darkness to haul up the gift of fresh water. Drawing water was not a casual act. It required strength and rhythm, lowering and raising heavy buckets, day after day. The work often fell to women, children, or thralls, who carried the burden of fetching water for the household. Imagine a Viking woman, wrapped in a woolen cloak against the morning chill, walking from the longhouse to the village well, her wooden bucket clutched in hand. Around her, the air smells of smoke and earth, the sound of roosters echoing through the dawn. She lowers the bucket, listens for the splash, and then pulls upward with steady arms. In her daily action lies the quiet heartbeat of the household: water for drinking, water for cooking, water for washing. But wells were not only practical. In the Viking mind, they also carried an aura of the sacred. In Norse mythology, some of the most powerful and mysterious places were wells. At the base of Yggdrasil, the great world tree, lay three mighty wells: Mimisbrunn, the well of wisdom; Urthabrunn, the well of fate; and Hövergelmir, the well of primal waters. These mythic springs were not far removed from the everyday wells that Viking men and women used. In drawing water, they touched a cycle older and deeper than themselves, connecting to the belief that beneath the surface of the world flowed knowledge, destiny, and life itself. Beyond wells, springs held special significance. Across Scandinavia, natural springs bubbled up from the earth, often forming clear pools or trickling streams. Such places were regarded with awe. Many were considered sacred, touched by the gods, the land spirits, or even the ancestors. Offerings were cast into their waters: beads, coins, carved wooden idols, or fragments of weapons. Archaeological evidence confirms this. In several locations, ritual deposits have been uncovered, showing that people did not merely use these springs for drinking, but honored them with reverence. A Viking traveler might pause at such a spring, kneel to drink from its cold clarity, and leave behind a token, perhaps a small piece of silver or a prayer whispered on the wind. To them, water was never only matter, it was spirit, mystery, and presence. The spring gave not only refreshment, but also a sense of connection to the divine. Sacred groves, too, were bound to water. Many Viking holy sites were located near springs or streams, where the boundary between human life and the unseen world seemed thinner. In these groves, shaded by ancient trees, rituals were performed, sacrifices made, and vows sworn. The proximity of water heightened the sanctity, for water was the eternal cleanser, the element that renewed and restored. In such places, Vikings believed one could stand at the edge of the mortal and touch the eternal. Practical necessity and spiritual imagination often walked side by side. Villages built near reliable springs or rivers thrived. Wells became gathering points, places where news was exchanged, gossip passed, and community reinforced. In the long Scandinavian winters, when snow covered the earth and rivers froze, access to water was a matter of survival. Springs that resisted freezing were treasured. Their flowing currents kept the community alive through the hardest months. Consider the landscape of Iceland, settled by Norse voyages in the 9th century. Harsh, volcanic, and cold, it tested the resilience of its settlers. Yet the land also offered hot springs, steaming with geothermal warmth, where settlers could bathe, cook, and cleanse. These springs became centers of life and legend, shaping not only survival but culture itself. To bathe in such a spring was to feel both the gift of the land and the mystery of fire and water combined. Water from the land was not always pure. Wells could become contaminated, springs could dry, and rivers could flood. To manage this, Vikings developed practices of care and caution. They reinforced wells with timber, covered them to keep out debris, and placed them strategically within settlements. Some evidence suggests they filtered water through cloth, moss, or sand, simple but effective methods to remove impurities. They knew, as we do, that water was both life and danger, a blessing that could turn to illness if neglected. The daily reliance on wells and springs also shaped Viking rhythm and memory. Children learned early the path to the well, the way to balance a bucket, the patience to draw water without spilling. Young men and women met at the well, exchanging glances as they carried their burdens. Elders told stories by the spring, weaving together myth and memory, while filling their cups. Water sources were more than physical features. They were woven into the social fabric of the village, and yet beneath this everyday familiarity lay something more profound. The Vikings lived in a world where nature was not silent but speaking. A spring could whisper wisdom, a well could hold fate, a stream could guide the soul of the departed. In every act of drinking, they were partaking in an ancient mystery. The land itself was alive, and water was its voice. When we picture Viking life, we must not only see the longship or the battlefield, we must also see the quiet moment at the well, the reflection of the sky in a spring, the ripple of water in a sacred grove. For it is here in these simple acts that the essence of their survival and their spirituality is found. Thus, water from the land was both ordinary and extraordinary. It sustained the body and nurtured the soul, it anchored the community and connected the people to their gods. From the deepest well to the most hidden spring, from the grove to the hearth, water shaped Viking existence, in ways as vital and enduring as the ocean voyages for which they are remembered. It was life in its purest form, drawn from the earth itself, carrying with it the taste of survival, reverence, and wonder. Salt was a treasure of the Viking world, a mineral that held the power to preserve life. For a people who spent weeks at sea or winters snowbound in their settlements, the ability to keep food and drink from rotting was as important as fire itself. Salt was gathered from coastal marshes, where seawater was left to evaporate, or traded from distant lands. It was costly, but its value justified the effort. When added to water, meat, or vegetables, salt slowed the decay of bacteria, keeping supplies safe long after they would otherwise have spoiled. For the Viking sailor or farmer, this meant survival in times when fresh resources were scarce, but salt was not their only ally. The Vikings were masters of fermentation, harnessing invisible armies of yeast and bacteria to transform fragile liquids into long-lasting nourishment. Water could be steeped with herbs, honey, or grains, and allowed to ferment slightly, creating a drink that resisted contamination. Weak beer and watered-down mead were not merely luxuries, they were strategies of preservation. Even children drank these diluted brews, not to grow drunk, but because the mild alcohol killed pathogens that would thrive in stagnant water. In this way, fermentation served as both science and safeguard, centuries before anyone understood microbes. Cabbages, root vegetables, and even fish could be packed in brine, transforming into tangy sour foods that kept their freshness through long journeys. Imagine a crew sailing across the North Sea, with barrels not only of mead, but also jars of salted herring or fermented turnips. The flavors may have been sharp, but they carried the essence of survival. Fermented water and foods gave the body strength, nourished the gut, and provided variety in diets that otherwise might have been bleak and monotonous. Preservation was also cultural. Feasting halls relied on mead that had been carefully stored and seasoned, its fermentation timed to mark seasonal festivals. Villages would share salted foods at winter gatherings, linking survival with ritual and community. The salty tang of preserved fish, the faint sweetness of watered-down ale, and the sour bite of pickled cabbage were more than sustenance. They were reminders of ingenuity and resilience. These tastes carried with them the knowledge that the Vikings had tamed nature's forces, bending salt, time, and fermentation to their will. The practice also reveals a broader truth about Viking life. They lived in harmony with cycles. Salt crystallized from the retreating tide, fermentation blossomed with the passing of weeks, and storage meant aligning human survival with the rhythms of the natural world. Water, the most fragile of all necessities, could be made safe not through barrels, but through transformation. It was not always clear to the Vikings why salted or fermented drinks lasted longer, but they knew it worked. Over generations, this wisdom became tradition, handed down with as much care as myths and sagas. And so, as ships sailed to far horizons and farms endured the long frost, salt and fermentation were quiet companions, invisible guardians of health. Their presence ensured that thirst would not bring despair, and that even in the darkest nights, the Vikings had resources to lean upon. To us, their methods may seem primitive, yet in truth, they were remarkably sophisticated, creating sustainable preservation systems that modern science still marvels at. Salted fish and fermented brews remind us that necessity has always been the mother of invention, and that survival can sometimes taste sharp, sweet, or strange. Salt fermentation and preservation tell us that the Vikings were not reckless raiders, but careful planners. Their mastery of these arts made possible the great voyages, the long winters, and the expansion of their culture across seas and continents. Without these quiet, invisible techniques, the Viking story might never have been written upon the waters of history. For the Vikings, water was not only for drinking, brewing, or survival, it was also sacred. Flowing streams, still ponds, and deep wells were regarded as more than physical sources of refreshment. They were doorways to mystery, vessels of divine presence, and places where the veil between worlds seemed thin. Just as thunder carried the voice of Thor, and the wind whispered with Odin's breath, water shimmered with the presence of unseen powers. Across the Norse world, wells and springs were often treated with reverence. Some were thought to be blessed by the gods, others haunted by spirits. Offerings were left at their edges, coins, beads, weapons, and sometimes animals' gifts cast into the water in hopes of gaining favor or protection. To stand by such a well was not merely to quench thirst, but to commune with forces beyond the human realm. The mythology itself reflected this sacred bond. At the roots of Yggdrasil, the great world tree, lay wells of cosmic importance. There was Mimi's well, a spring of wisdom so powerful that even Odin, the All-Father, sacrificed an eye to drink from it. There was Uatharbrunn, the well of fate, where the Norns, the weavers of destiny, spun the threads of human lives. These mythic waters were more than stories. They shaped how Vikings perceived every stream and pool they encountered. To drink was not only to sustain the body, but symbolically to sip from the veins of the cosmos. Ritual water use was woven into community life. Before great journeys, water might be sprinkled in blessings over ships, invoking safe passage across the waves. Warriors could wash in sacred streams before battle, purifying themselves in body and spirit. During ceremonies, water mixed with blood, mead, or herbs was scattered to sanctify spaces, transforming ordinary gatherings into sacred rites. In this way, the Vikings acknowledged that water was not neutral, it carried power. Wells in particular became centers of worship. Archaeological finds in Scandinavia reveal deposits of ritual objects sunk into their depths: bones, tools, carved figurines, and jewelry. These were not accidents, they were deliberate sacrifices, gifts entrusted to the unseen beings thought to dwell in those dark, still waters. For the Vikings, wells were more than holes in the ground, they were thresholds linking the human world with the divine. The connection between water and destiny was profound. Just as rivers carve valleys and seas shape coastlines, so too did the Vikings believe water shaped fate. Standing beside a well, they might imagine the Norns themselves weaving unseen patterns, while the water mirrored the shifting threads of fortune. Drinking from such places was, therefore, an act of reverence and hope, a way of aligning one's life with the larger currents of existence. Even in daily life, echoes of this reverence remained. A farmer drawing water for his household may have whispered a quiet prayer, remembering stories of gods and spirits. A sailor filling his barrels before a voyage may have thought of Mimi's well, hoping for wisdom on the unpredictable sea. To live among rivers, fjords, and wells was to live within a spiritual geography, where water was never just water. This blending of the practical and the sacred reflects a larger truth about Viking culture: nothing was merely ordinary. The axe that split wood was also a weapon of battle. The fire that warmed homes was also the flame of ritual, and water which quenched thirst, was also the element through which the gods spoke. Their world was alive with meaning, every drop shimmering with unseen significance. As centuries passed, some of these practices merged with later Christian traditions, where holy wells and blessed springs continued to be revered, yet the roots of this reverence stretched deep into Viking belief. To this day, Scandinavian folklore speaks of hidden beings dwelling near water, spirits, nymphs, and guardians whose presence lingers, echoing the old ways. The sacred wells remind us that for the Vikings, survival was never just physical, it was spiritual, cultural, and cosmic. By honoring water, they honored the balance of life itself, acknowledging that the same element that sustained their bodies also nourished their souls. To drink was to survive, to offer was to connect, to revere was to belong. Thus sacred wells and ritual waters became more than places on a map. They were anchors of meaning in a world vast and unpredictable. When we look back at the Viking Age, we see not only warriors and explorers, but also pilgrims who bowed their heads beside still waters, whispering prayers into the depths. Their reverence reminds us that survival is not only a matter of quenching thirst, it is also a matter of finding meaning in the sources that sustain us. In Norse mythology, water is not a background element. It is a living symbol, flowing through tales of creation, fate, destruction, and renewal. To the Vikings, water was not just something to drink, cross, or fear. It was the mirror of life itself, unpredictable, essential, and deeply mysterious. From the very beginning of the Norse cosmos, water plays a central role. In the myth of creation, before there was sky or earth, there was Ginnungagap, the yawning void. Out of this emptiness came two primal realms, Niflheim, a world of ice, frost, and deadly cold, and Muspelheim, a realm of fire and searing heat. When the icy rivers of Niflheim met the blazing sparks of Muspelheim in the center of Ginnungagap, their clash produced steam, mist, and flowing drops. From this mingling of frozen water and burning flame emerged Ymir, the first giant, whose body would later form the world itself. Thus the Norse universe was born from a meeting of water and fire, chaos made flesh, through liquid's transforming power. But water was more than the substance of creation, it was also the vessel of wisdom. In myth, Mimir's well lay beneath one of Yggdrasil's roots, a deep reservoir of knowledge. Its waters contained all the secrets of the cosmos. Odin, the All-Father, seeking understanding beyond that of gods or men, came to this well. To drink from it, he sacrificed one of his eyes. This act revealed the depth of water's symbolism. True wisdom is not gained freely. It is drawn from hidden depths, requiring sacrifice. To drink from the well was to immerse oneself in mystery, to taste the very marrow of creation. Water also marked the passage of fate. Beside Yggdrasil's roots lay another well, Brunn, the well of fate, tended by the Norns. These three mysterious women, Ertha, what has been Verthen, what is becoming, and Skuld, what shall be. Each day, they drew water from their sacred well and sprinkled it upon the roots of Yggdrasil to keep the world tree alive. Their act symbolized life's fragile dependence upon water. Without it, even the mightiest tree in existence would wither. In the same way, all beings, whether gods, giants, or humans, depended upon water to nourish their existence and sustain the weaving of fate. The sea itself embodied both opportunity and peril. For seafaring Vikings, the ocean was a road, a battlefield, and a grave. In mythology, the sea was personified in beings of immense power. Aegir, the sea giant, ruled the deep from his shimmering hall, where waves rose and fell at his command. His wife Ran cast her net to snare sailors and pull them into the depths, reminding mortals that the ocean's bounty was balanced by its hunger. To the Norse mind, the sea symbolized the duality of life, giver of wealth through trade and raiding, yet taker of lives without warning. To embark upon it was always to gamble with fate. Water was also a force of destruction and renewal. The myths foretell Ragnarök, the end of the world. During this apocalyptic struggle, the Midgard serpent, Jörmungandr, who encircles the earth in the sea's embrace, rises from the deep. His thrashing stirs the waters into floods that drown the lands, sweeping away kingdoms and kindreds alike. Yet, though this deluge destroys, it also cleanses. Out of the drowned world, a new earth will rise, green and fertile, its rivers flowing fresh once more. Water here becomes a symbol of cyclical renewal, showing that endings are also beginnings, and death carries within it the seed of life. Even the imagery of drinking horns and mead halls carries water's symbolic weight. Mead, though brewed from honey, was mixed and tempered with water, transforming it into a drink fit for warriors and gods. To lift a horn was not simply to drink, but to participate in a ritual of fellowship, fate, and remembrance. Water was the unseen companion of every toast, every oath, every feast. Rivers, too, were not merely landscapes in myth, they were boundaries. In tales of the afterlife, rivers separated the living from the dead, held the realm of the departed, was approached across such thresholds, echoing a universal motif found across cultures. Water as the border between this world and the next. For the Norse, to cross a river was often to cross into the unknown. What emerges through these stories is a tapestry of meanings. Water is creation, flowing out of the clash of opposites. It is wisdom, hidden in wells and earned through sacrifice. It is fate, drawn and poured by the Norns. It is peril, embodied in the sea's unpredictable depths. It is destruction, unleashed during Ragnarok, and it is renewal, flowing once again in the reborn world. To the Vikings then, water was never inert. It was alive with story, with power, with spirit. Every stream mirrored the first rivers of Niflheim. Every well recalled Mimir's hidden spring. Every tide carried the whisper of Ran's net. The symbolism of water infused their world with a sense of awe, reminding them that life itself is like a river, sometimes calm, sometimes violent, always moving toward an unknown sea. When we reflect on Norse mythology today, we often picture swords, battles, and gods of thunder. Yet beneath these images flows the quiet, constant presence of water, binding the myths together. It is the symbol of life's origins, the drink of wisdom, the shaper of destiny, the destroyer and renewer of worlds. To understand Viking belief is to see beneath the surface, the streams of water running through their imagination. And so water stands not only as a necessity of survival, but as a sacred mirror of existence. To the Vikings, to drink was to live, but also to touch the mysteries of the cosmos. To sail was to risk everything, yet also to participate in the eternal drama of gods and seas. To offer water in ritual was to echo the Norns, nourishing life's great tree. In this way, the Norse myths transform water into one of their most profound symbols, the element that is at once beginning and end, wisdom and fate, danger and renewal. Like the rivers of their homeland, the meaning of water runs deep, winding endlessly, reflecting the sky above while hiding secrets below. The Viking world was a place of extremes. The lands they inhabited, from Norway's jagged fjords to the sweeping plains of Denmark and the icy shores of Iceland, were bound tightly to the seasons. And while water was a constant necessity, the challenges of storing, carrying, and preserving it changed dramatically between the searing height of summer and the biting chill of winter. For the Norse people, survival depended not only on their ingenuity, but also on their ability to adapt to nature's shifting moods. In summer, water was abundant. Streams swelled with melted snow, lakes shimmered under long hours of sunlight, and even bogs and marshes could provide drinkable sources if one knew how to filter them. Yet abundance brought its own dangers. Stagnant pools bred disease. Carried water spoiled quickly in the heat. Travelers risked dehydration on long journeys beneath the blazing sun. The Vikings learned to combat these risks with methods born of careful observation. They refreshed stored water more frequently in the summer months, recognizing that the sun's warmth hastened decay. On ships, they often covered their water containers with cloth or animal hides to shield them from direct sunlight. Some sagas even mention warriors cooling water in the shade of sails, knowing that the difference of just a few degrees could prolong its freshness. But summer also offered its blessings. The Vikings sometimes flavored their water with herbs like mint or juniper, not only to improve taste, but also to lend antibacterial properties. Fermented drinks, too, were more easily brewed in the warmth, offering a safer alternative for both daily life and raiding voyages. Mead, ale, and weak beers stood in as partial substitutes for water when the risks of spoilage loomed large. For a people who labored under the sun, these drinks were not luxuries, but carefully calculated strategies for hydration and preservation. Winter, however, brought opposite dangers. When lakes froze solid and rivers became sheets of ice, water could no longer be gathered freely. The Viking solution was both simple and brilliant. They embraced the very force that threatened them. Ice and snow became reservoirs of stored water, gathered in large blocks and kept insulated beneath straw or earth. Melting snow was a laborious process, but with fire always at the center of their homes, it was never beyond reach. In harsh winters, water stored in containers might freeze, but Vikings anticipated this by leaving enough space within their skins, wooden buckets or clay pots to prevent cracking. Those with foresight buried containers in the ground or stored them in caves, where temperatures remained stable and freezing was less likely. The psychological contrast between the seasons was stark. In summer, water was plentiful but fragile. In winter it was scarce but pure. This rhythm shaped the Viking relationship to nature. It made them cautious in times of plenty and resourceful in times of want. It also deepened their reverence for balance, a recurring theme in their myths and sagas. Just as the gods struggled to maintain order between chaos and creation, so too did Viking households balance their water supplies between excess and deprivation. Seasonal adaptation extended to their voyages as well. Summer raids and trade journeys required careful planning for heat, while winter expeditions across icy seas demanded different strategies. Sailors sometimes melted ice taken from northern shores and stored it aboard, trusting it to last longer than any fresh water drawn from a river. Meanwhile, settlements on land organized seasonal tasks around the rhythms of water, gathering and preserving herbs in summer to cleanse water, or cutting ice in winter to store for leaner months ahead. The Viking mastery of seasonal challenges reflected not just survival instincts but also a philosophy of resilience. They did not resist nature's cycles, they moved with them. Each season brought its hardships but also its gifts. In learning to manage both, the Norse forged a way of life that could endure across centuries of cold winters, fleeting summers, and perilous seas. Through this lens, water becomes more than a daily necessity in the Viking story. It becomes a mirror of their culture, fragile yet enduring, fleeting yet eternal, shaped always by the turning of the year. And just as they passed their sagas from one generation to the next, so too did they pass their wisdom about water, ensuring that no season, however harsh, could break the chain of survival. When we imagine Vikings, our minds often drift to the open sea, to long ships slicing through frothing waves, sails catching the northern wind, warriors gripping oars. But the story of Viking water is not only one of the ocean, it is also a story of the land, of places where water welled up quietly from the earth, where springs bubbled in forest glades, and where entire communities came together to draw life from the soil itself. To understand how Vikings secured their water, we must turn from the salt of the sea to the sweetness of the ground. Across Scandinavia, villages often relied on wells. These were not the elaborate stone wells of later medieval Europe, with ornate wooden roofs and careful masonry. Viking wells were humbler, dug into the soil, and lined with timber or stone to prevent collapse. Some were little more than shallow shafts, reaching down to the groundwater table, while others were deep, carefully reinforced pits that showed the hand of skilled craftsmanship. Archaeologists have uncovered such wells in Viking farmsteads, their linings still intact, whispering of the people who once lowered buckets down into the darkness to haul up the gift of fresh water. Drawing water was not a casual act. It required strength and rhythm, lowering and raising heavy buckets, day after day. The work often fell to women, children, or thralls, who carried the burden of fetching water for the household. Imagine a Viking woman, wrapped in a woolen cloak against the morning chill, walking from the longhouse to the village well, her wooden bucket clutched in hand. Around her, the air smells of smoke and earth, the sound of roosters echoing through the dawn. She lowers the bucket, listens for the splash, and then pulls upward with steady arms. In her daily action lies the quiet heartbeat of the household: water for drinking, water for cooking, water for washing. But wells were not only practical. In the Viking mind, they also carried an aura of the sacred. In Norse mythology, some of the most powerful and mysterious places were wells. At the base of Yggdrasil, the great world tree, lay three mighty wells: Mimisbrunn, the well of wisdom; Urtherbrunn, the well of fate; and Hövergelmir, the well of primal waters. These mythic springs were not far removed from the everyday wells that Viking men and women used. In drawing water, they touched a cycle older and deeper than themselves, connecting to the belief that beneath the surface of the world flowed knowledge, destiny, and life itself. Beyond wells, springs held special significance. Across Scandinavia, natural springs bubbled up from the earth, often forming clear pools or trickling streams. Such places were regarded with awe. Many were considered sacred, touched by the gods, the land spirits, or even the ancestors. Offerings were cast into their waters: beads, coins, carved wooden idols, or fragments of weapons. Archaeological evidence confirms this. In several locations, ritual deposits have been uncovered, showing that people did not merely use these springs for drinking, but honored them with reverence. A Viking traveler might pause at such a spring, kneel to drink from its cold clarity, and leave behind a token, perhaps a small piece of silver or a prayer whispered on the wind. To them, water was never only matter, it was spirit, mystery, and presence. The spring gave not only refreshment, but also a sense of connection to the divine. Sacred groves, too, were bound to water. Many Viking holy sites were located near springs or streams, where the boundary between human life and the unseen world seemed thinner. In these groves, shaded by ancient trees, rituals were performed, sacrifices made, and vows sworn. The proximity of water heightened the sanctity, for water was the eternal cleanser, the element that renewed and restored. In such places, Vikings believed one could stand at the edge of the mortal and touch the eternal. Practical necessity and spiritual imagination often walked side by side. Villages built near reliable springs or rivers thrived. Wells became gathering points, places where news was exchanged, gossip passed, and community reinforced. In the long Scandinavian winters, when snow covered the earth and rivers froze, access to water was a matter of survival. Springs that resisted freezing were treasured. Their flowing currents kept the community alive through the hardest months. Consider the landscape of Iceland, settled by Norse voyages in the 9th century. Harsh, volcanic, and cold, it tested the resilience of its settlers. Yet the land also offered hot springs, steaming with geothermal warmth, where settlers could bathe, cook, and cleanse. These springs became centers of life and legend, shaping not only survival but culture itself. To bathe in such a spring was to feel both the gift of the land and the mystery of fire and water combined. Water from the land was not always pure. Wells could become contaminated, springs could dry, and rivers could flood. To manage this, Vikings developed practices of care and caution. They reinforced wells with timber, covered them to keep out debris, and placed them strategically within settlements. Some evidence suggests they filtered water through cloth, moss, or sand, simple but effective methods to remove impurities. They knew, as we do, that water was both life and danger, a blessing that could turn to illness if neglected. The daily reliance on wells and springs also shaped Viking rhythm and memory. Children learned early the path to the well, the way to balance a bucket, the patience to draw water without spilling. Young men and women met at the well, exchanging glances as they carried their burdens. Elders told stories by the spring, weaving together myth and memory, while filling their cups. Water sources were more than physical features. They were woven into the social fabric of the village, and yet beneath this everyday familiarity lay something more profound. The Vikings lived in a world where nature was not silent but speaking. A spring could whisper wisdom, a well could hold fate, a stream could guide the soul of the departed. In every act of drinking, they were partaking in an ancient mystery. The land itself was alive, and water was its voice. When we picture Viking life, we must not only see the longship or the battlefield, we must also see the quiet moment at the well, the reflection of the sky in a spring, the ripple of water in a sacred grove. For it is here in these simple acts that the essence of their survival and their spirituality is found. Thus, water from the land was both ordinary and extraordinary. It sustained the body and nurtured the soul. It anchored the community and connected the people to their gods. From the deepest well to the most hidden spring, from the grove to the hearth, water shaped Viking existence, in ways as vital and enduring as the ocean voyages for which they are remembered. It was life in its purest form, drawn from the earth itself, carrying with it the taste of survival, reverence and wonder. When we imagine the Viking world, we often see warriors at sea, farmers in the fields, or skalds reciting sagas by firelight. Yet, one of the most fascinating aspects of their lives remains hidden in the shadows, the way they slept. Just as they had unique approaches to water, food and travel, the Vikings also lived by rhythms of sleep that seem foreign to us today, rhythms that reveal much about human nature itself. In the modern age, we assume that a single stretch of uninterrupted sleep is normal. 8 hours from night to morning is considered the standard. But in the Viking Age, and indeed in much of the medieval world, the night was often divided into two separate sleeps, sometimes called first sleep and second sleep. Between them lay a period of quiet wakefulness, a liminal time when the household stirred softly in the dark. Imagine a Viking longhouse on a winter's night. The fire has burned low, leaving a faint glow among the embers. Men, women, and children lie beneath furs, huddled for warmth. Outside, the world is silent, snow blanketing the earth. They drift into their first sleep, soon after dusk, the long northern nights offering hours of rest. Yet several hours later, before dawn has come, eyes begin to open. People rise not with alarm, but with calm acceptance, for this waking is expected. During this interval, the household might tend the fire, step outside to relieve themselves, or murmur prayers to the gods. Some might share whispered conversations, exchange tenderness with their partners, or quietly reflect on dreams. In many cultures, such midnight hours were considered a time of special clarity, a space for thought, divination, and intimacy. Then gradually, they would settle again into their second sleep, continuing until the first light of morning. The Vikings, like many of their contemporaries, did not consider this broken sleep to be a problem. It was a natural part of the cycle of night and day, shaped by the length of darkness in northern lands. Their lives were governed not by clocks, but by the turning of seasons, the rising of the sun, and the settling of dusk. In such a world, waking in the middle of the night was not an intrusion, but a rhythm of life itself. Modern science has, in fact, confirmed this. Studies show that humans left without artificial light or schedules often revert to segmented sleep, two periods divided by an hour or two of wakefulness. Our bodies may be wired for this older rhythm, only pushed aside by the demands of modern industry and electric lighting. The Viking experience of sleep, then, is not alien, but deeply human. It suggests that our own struggles with insomnia or midnight waking may not be disorders at all, but echoes of an ancient pattern. Beyond their daily sleep, the Vikings also connected dreams with meaning. In the sagas, dreams are not dismissed as random. They are messages, warnings or glimpses of fate. A warrior might dream of ravens circling overhead, a sign of Odin's presence. A farmer might dream of fields heavy with grain, a promise of good harvest. Dreams born in the hours between first and second sleep carried weight and mystery. To awaken in the night and speak of a dream by the hearth was to brush against the realm of the unseen. This intertwining of sleep, dreams and destiny reveals another lesson from Viking life. Rest was not merely physical, it was also spiritual. The stillness of the night was an opening to the world beyond sight, a threshold where the gods might whisper or fate might stir. In a society where survival depended on weather, war, and the whims of fortune, such messages were taken seriously. We might also reflect on the communal nature of Viking sleep. In longhouses, many shared the same space, lying close together. Privacy was rare, and sleep was a collective act. Children nestled beside parents, travelers alongside hosts, servants near masters. This closeness created warmth, but also intimacy, a sense of shared vulnerability. The night was not something to endure alone, but something to face together. In our modern age, where solitude is common and loneliness widespread, there is something poignant in this vision of sleep as a communal bond. Finally, the Viking rhythms of sleep teach us about balance. Their nights were long, their days shaped by the seasons, and their bodies moved in harmony with these natural cycles. They accepted waking in darkness without anxiety, drifting between sleep, wakefulness, and dreams as naturally as the tide rises and falls. For us today, who often battle against sleeplessness with frustration, their approach offers comfort. To wake at night is not a failure, it is part of our heritage, a reminder that rest is larger than a rigid schedule. So as we reflect on the forgotten rhythms of Viking sleep, we discover not just a curiosity of history, but a mirror of ourselves. Their two-part nights, their reverence for dreams, their communal warmth, and their calm acceptance of nature's cycles, speak across the centuries. They remind us that sleep is not simply about hours counted, but about harmony with the world around us. Perhaps this is the final lesson, that in sleep as in life, the Vikings trusted in rhythm, in flow, in the balance between darkness and light. And in remembering their ways, we may rediscover peace in our own restless nights. For the Vikings, water was not only for drinking, brewing, or survival, it was also sacred. Flowing streams, still ponds, and deep wells were regarded as more than physical sources of refreshment. They were doorways to mystery, vessels of divine presence, and places where the veil between worlds seemed thin. Just as thunder carried the voice of Thor, and the wind whispered with Odin's breath, water shimmered with the presence of unseen powers. Across the Norse world, wells and springs were often treated with reverence. Some were thought to be blessed by the gods, others haunted by spirits. Offerings were left at their edges, coins, beads, weapons, and sometimes animals' gifts cast into the water in hopes of gaining favor or protection. To stand by such a well was not merely to quench thirst, but to commune with forces beyond the human realm. The mythology itself reflected this sacred bond. At the roots of Yggdrasil, the great world tree, lay wells of cosmic importance. There was Mimi's well, a spring of wisdom so powerful that even Odin, the All-Father, sacrificed an eye to drink from it. There was Uatharbrunn, the well of fate, where the Norns, the weavers of destiny, spun the threads of human lives. These mythic waters were more than stories. They shaped how Vikings perceived every stream and pool they encountered. To drink was not only to sustain the body, but symbolically to sip from the veins of the cosmos. Ritual water use was woven into community life. Before great journeys, water might be sprinkled in blessings over ships, invoking safe passage across the waves. Warriors could wash in sacred streams before battle, purifying themselves in body and spirit. During ceremonies, water mixed with blood, mead, or herbs was scattered to sanctify spaces, transforming ordinary gatherings into sacred rites. In this way, the Vikings acknowledged that water was not neutral, it carried power. Wells in particular became centers of worship. Archaeological finds in Scandinavia reveal deposits of ritual objects sunk into their depths: bones, tools, carved figurines, and jewelry. These were not accidents, they were deliberate sacrifices, gifts entrusted to the unseen beings thought to dwell in those dark, still waters. For the Vikings, wells were more than holes in the ground, they were thresholds linking the human world with the divine. The connection between water and destiny was profound. Just as rivers carve valleys and seas shape coastlines, so too did the Vikings believe water shaped fate. Standing beside a well, they might imagine the Norns themselves weaving unseen patterns, while the water mirrored the shifting threads of fortune. Drinking from such places was, therefore, an act of reverence and hope, a way of aligning one's life with the larger currents of existence. Even in daily life, echoes of this reverence remained. A farmer drawing water for his household may have whispered a quiet prayer, remembering stories of gods and spirits. A sailor filling his barrels before a voyage may have thought of Mimi's well, hoping for wisdom on the unpredictable sea. To live among rivers, fjords, and wells was to live within a spiritual geography, where water was never just water. This blending of the practical and the sacred reflects a larger truth about Viking culture: nothing was merely ordinary. The axe that split wood was also a weapon of battle. The fire that warmed homes was also the flame of ritual, and water which quenched thirst was also the element through which the gods spoke. Their world was alive with meaning, every drop shimmering with unseen significance. As centuries passed, some of these practices merged with later Christian traditions, where holy wells and blessed springs continued to be revered, yet the roots of this reverence stretched deep into Viking belief. To this day, Scandinavian folklore speaks of hidden beings dwelling near water, spirits, nymphs, and guardians whose presence lingers, echoing the old ways. The sacred wells remind us that for the Vikings, survival was never just physical, it was spiritual, cultural, and cosmic. By honoring water, they honored the balance of life itself, acknowledging that the same element that sustained their bodies also nourished their souls. To drink was to survive, to offer was to connect, to revere was to belong. Thus sacred wells and ritual waters became more than places on a map. They were anchors of meaning in a world vast and unpredictable. When we look back at the Viking Age, we see not only warriors and explorers, but also pilgrims who bowed their heads beside still waters, whispering prayers into the depths. Their reverence reminds us that survival is not only a matter of quenching thirst, it is also a matter of finding meaning in the sources that sustain us.